December 15th, 1971, a Pakistan International Airlines Boeing 707 flying from Karachi to Urumqi crash lands in Xinjiang, deep in western China. The crew walked away with only minor injuries. But what happened next was something strange. Instead of the usual crash investigators, a team of Chinese engineers quietly descends on the site. But they're not here to investigate. They're here to take the plane apart, piece by piece, figuring out exactly how it was built. Because at this point, China didn't really know how to build a commercial aircraft. And what emerged next shocked the entire world. After just 9 years in 1980, China rolled out the Y-10, its first large passenger jet, built almost entirely from reverse-engineered Boeing wreckage. Anyone who looked at it could instantly see how similar it was to the 707. But its aerodynamics were so poor, China quietly shelved the whole program. But since then, things have changed. Beijing has funneled billions of dollars into a single state-backed company called COMAC with one goal: take on Boeing and Airbus head-on in the global market. And in a concerning development for both manufacturers, European regulators have already begun test flying COMAC's flagship, the C919, meaning there's a real chance we could soon see Chinese jets taking over the European skies. But certification might be the least interesting part of this story, because what's happening off the radar is what Boeing and Airbus should really be worried about. So can China really break up the Airbus-Boeing duopoly to become the world's third major plane manufacturer? For decades, China watched from the sidelines as its state-owned airlines funneled hundreds of billions of dollars into the pockets of two foreign manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus. For a country known as the world's factory, that was a striking paradox. Every jet that lifted off from Beijing or Shanghai sent profits into foreign hands rather than a manufacturer of its own. To Beijing, that wasn't acceptable. So in 2006, the Chinese Communist Party's latest 5-year plan came with a bold directive. China would build its own commercial aircraft and spare no expense doing it. The result, the COMAC C919, China's first domestically developed narrow-body jet. More than a decade in the making. It's a single-aisle aircraft configured for 168 passengers, placing it squarely in the same category as the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A320. It has a modern glass cockpit, fly-by-wire controls, and the composite materials you'd expect on a modern airliner. On paper, it belongs in the same conversation as its Western rivals. And that conversation matters enormously because the 737 MAX and the A320neo aren't just popular aircraft. They are the backbone of global aviation. These narrow-body jets cover domestic routes, medium-haul corridors, and everything in between, accounting for more than half of the global passenger fleet. For decades, Boeing and Airbus have functioned as a duopoly, controlling roughly 90% of the market. But recently, we've seen exactly how dangerous that concentration of power can be. Boeing's troubles over the past several years have been nothing short of chaos. Safety concerns, manufacturing lapses, and a catastrophic erosion of public trust have severely hampered the company's ability to deliver aircraft at the rate the industry needs. And that became impossible to ignore when a door plug blew out of an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX mid-flight in January 2024. Investigators found 4 critical bolts holding that panel in place were simply missing. An almost incomprehensible lapse at one of Boeing's core facilities. But the problems don't stop at Boeing. Reliability concerns with Pratt & Whitney's geared turbofan engine have forced airlines to ground and even dismantle brand new Airbus jets just to scavenge spare parts, creating a severe shortage across the industry. And it gets worse. Both manufacturers are buried under massive production backlogs. Airlines are desperate for new jets, while Boeing and Airbus struggle to keep up. If you ordered a 737 MAX or an A320neo today, you could realistically wait over a decade for delivery. And those wait times are only getting longer. That is precisely why Beijing hopes its own model can compete with the Western giants. First as the dominant carrier at home, and one day on the global stage. To seize that opportunity, the Chinese government is believed to have poured staggering sums into the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, known as COMAC. According to Scott Kennedy, a Chinese economy expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, total government investment since its founding is estimated between $49 billion and $72 billion. That figure alone tells you how seriously Beijing takes this bet. But the C919 is not the only aircraft COMAC is building. There is also the C929, a wide-body jet seating between 250 and 320 passengers, putting it in the same segment as the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 787, another profitable market dominated by the Western giants. In other words, COMAC isn't just coming for the narrow body market. It intends to take the Western duopoly head on. And that has done something remarkable. It has pushed Boeing and Airbus closer together. For most of their history, these two have been fierce rivals. In the early years, Boeing dismissed Airbus as an overly subsidised upstart. That became harder to sustain in 1988, when Airbus launched the A320 and began overtaking Boeing in orders. The rivalry escalated into legal warfare, with the United States filing a formal challenge at the World Trade Organization in 2004 over European subsidies to Airbus. The EU hit back, accusing Washington of giving Boeing comparable support. What followed was the longest and most expensive trade dispute in WTO history, over $1 billion in tariffs and decades of litigation. But in 2021, the US and EU agreed to suspend those punitive measures, deciding instead to cooperate against what both sides openly called the common threat of COMAC. So does COMAC actually have what it takes? Well, the answer is far more complicated than you might think. Even though the C919 has been certified by China's own Civil Aviation Administration, the CAAC, it lacks approval from the world's two most consequential regulators, the FAA in the United States and EASA in Europe. This is not a minor procedural hurdle. Most countries require that any aircraft operated by their national carriers be validated by one of these bodies. And industry sources at non-Chinese lessors and airlines have consistently said they'd want validation of the C919 before even considering it. While EASA pilots have begun test flights in Shanghai as part of the formal validation process, full certification is not expected until at least the end of this decade. Until that stamp of approval arrives, the C919's international prospects remain severely limited. But that hasn't stopped Beijing from pursuing a different kind of market, one where political relationships matter more than regulatory credentials. In recent years, China has dramatically expanded its economic footprint across Asia and Africa, financing infrastructure projects and extending unconditional loans to developing nations, bypassing the strict conditions Western lenders like the IMF attach. In return, China hopes to shape the buying decisions of these countries, expecting them to favour Chinese-made products, including aircraft. Beyond lending, Chinese investment groups have quietly taken stakes in struggling and start-up airlines across these regions, nudging them toward COMAC. That made headlines in April 2023, when Transnusa became the first airline outside China to fly COMAC jets between Manado and Guangzhou. More recently, Gallop Air of Brunei signed for 15 C919s and 15 ARJ21s. But in both cases, the airlines were either fully or substantially Chinese-owned. Look closely, and you realise these aren't independent commercial decisions, they're engineered outcomes. Adding to that, COMAC offers its aircraft at significantly lower prices than either Boeing or Airbus. On paper, the value proposition looks compelling, and yet most airlines remain deeply reluctant to buy. So why is that? You see, China has no meaningful global maintenance and repair network for the C919. There is no reliable international infrastructure for sourcing spare parts or managing unplanned downtime in an industry that runs on razor-thin margins. That uncertainty isn't a minor inconvenience. It is a business-ending risk. A grounded aircraft generates zero revenue, and every day it sits on the tarmac waiting for a part that cannot be sourced is a loss. The airline, especially a small regional budget carrier, simply cannot afford. Then there is the production rate, which has been extraordinarily slow. COMAC targeted 75 deliveries in 2025. It managed just 15. By the middle of 2026, only around 40 aircraft had been delivered in total, every single one to a Chinese state carrier, not one to a foreign operator. For context, Boeing and Airbus each complete more than one aircraft every single day. COMAC has announced plans to reach 150 aircraft a year by 2030. But even if it hits that goal, which is far from guaranteed, it will still take well into the 2030s to clear the backlog. At that pace, airlines are better off ordering Western jets, which carry similar wait times but come with far superior support and maintenance networks. So is COMAC destined for failure? Well, here is where the situation tips in its favour. And to understand it, you have to understand the market China is sitting on. China is already one of the world's 3 largest aviation markets, alongside the United States and India. But right now, it isn't just growing, it is exploding. By 2035, analysts project that over 1 billion Chinese travellers will fly every single year. 1 billion passengers, more than the entire population of Europe, all needing aircraft to move them across one of the largest countries on the planet. And by 2042, China is expected to account for 20% of global aircraft demand, more than 8,500 new commercial jets over the next 2 decades. That is an almost incomprehensible number. So rather than allowing Boeing and Airbus to absorb that demand, Beijing is planning to redirect it inward, using its own aviation boom as a structural subsidy for COMAC. The order book makes that intent transparent. The C919 has recorded nearly 1,200 orders across 25 customers, almost all Chinese state-owned carriers or airlines with significant Chinese ownership. A captive market engineered by design. And that gives COMAC a foundation regional rivals like Embraer and Bombardier never had, since they depend almost entirely on sales abroad. But there's a catch. Actually, there are several, and some are not problems Beijing can simply spend its way out of. As I mentioned earlier, COMAC's build rate is so slow, it's already struggling to fulfill its existing order book. Now, China's other industries have proven the country can scale up mass production when it sets its mind to it. The high-speed rail network, the automobile sector. But COMAC's situation is more complicated because its production rate does not depend solely on its own capabilities. Despite being marketed as China's homegrown aircraft, only the bare airframe of the C919, the fuselage and the wings, is manufactured by Chinese entities. For everything else, the engines, the avionics, the landing gear, and a long list of other critical systems, COMAC remains heavily dependent on Western suppliers like Honeywell, Liebherr, and CFM International. In fact, nearly 70% of the C919 is built by non-Chinese companies, and that is where the problems begin to stack up. You may already know about Boeing and Airbus's recent supply chain delays. Since many of those same suppliers feed directly into COMAC's line, COMAC hits those exact same bottlenecks. And even when conditions improve, suppliers naturally prioritise their long-standing partners, the ones ordering hundreds of thousands of components a year, pushing COMAC further down the queue. But the supplier issue runs deeper than logistics. There is a far more controversial dimension to the C919 story, one that stretches across multiple countries and involves allegations of industrial espionage. Over the C919's development, there have been serious, well-documented allegations of espionage targeting key component suppliers in the United States and elsewhere. Multiple individuals believed to be acting for Chinese institutions have been arrested at foreign suppliers, allegedly to obtain technical information that could reverse engineer critical systems. The most prominent conviction came in November 2022, when Chinese intelligence officer Xu Yanjun was found guilty of espionage in the United States and sentenced to 20 years. His case, and a series of similar prosecutions, centred on GE Aviation, Safran, and Honeywell, all key contributors to the C919. The jet's striking resemblance to the Airbus A320neo has only fueled the speculation, especially since Airbus runs a final assembly line for the A320neo in China. The consequences have been entirely predictable. Western companies are now deeply reluctant to share their most advanced technology with Chinese partners. And nowhere is this more visible than in the engines. The C919 is powered by the LEAP engine, made by CFM International, a joint venture between General Electric and France's Safran. While it shares a name with the engines on the 737 MAX and A320neo, it is not the same machine. According to a Forbes investigation, the variant supplied to COMAC has been deliberately detuned, with internal architecture that owes far more to CFM's older CFM56 platform from the 1970s than to the cutting-edge variant flying on Western jets. And then there is geopolitics, perhaps the most volatile variable of all. The United States has long accused China of stealing advanced technology to bolster its military capabilities, an allegation Beijing has consistently denied. In January 2021, the Trump administration added COMAC to a list of firms it claimed were supporting China's military, restricting its access to American technology and capital. That restriction was later lifted, but the damage to the relationship wasn't. Since then, escalating trade conflicts have cut both ways. Chinese authorities have quietly dampened domestic orders for Boeing, and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo accused Beijing in 2021 of blocking its own carriers from buying tens of billions of dollars worth of American aircraft. But Washington hit back in the hardest way possible. In the summer of 2025, the United States suspended export licenses for the CFM LEAP engine, the only engine the C919 can currently fly on. And just like that, production seized up. That 2-month ban is a huge part of why deliveries collapsed to just 15 that year. One decision in Washington, and China's flagship program simply stopped. The message was unambiguous. China's proudest jet runs on Western components, and Washington retains the ability to turn that supply off whenever it chooses. So put all of that together, and by every measure, the picture looks bleak. But here is where the story takes a turn that Boeing and Airbus should genuinely fear. Because Beijing has looked at that engine ban, that single point of failure, and drawn exactly the conclusion you'd expect. If the LEAP engine is the leash, then the answer is to cut it. Enter the CJ1000A, a homegrown engine built by the state-owned Aero Engine Corporation of China, designed to do one thing: replace the Western LEAP entirely. And in the new 5-year plan approved in 2026, Beijing didn't just fund it. It named accelerating that engine a top national priority. The CJ1000A has already begun flight testing, mounted on a Y-20 military transport, and it's now moving toward the C919 itself, with entry into service targeted around the end of the decade. Now, matching a modern Western engine is brutally hard, and there is no guarantee China pulls it off on time. Chinese engine programs have a long history of slipping. But think about what happens if they do. The moment the C919 no longer needs an American export license, its production ceiling stops being set by Washington and starts being set by Chinese industry alone. Every bottleneck we talked about, the supplier queue, the export bans, the leverage the West holds, they all loosen at once. The single greatest weakness in the entire program becomes, potentially, the thing that sets it free. So where does all this leave us? COMAC is unlikely to break the Boeing Airbus duopoly in any meaningful global sense. Not this decade, and almost certainly not the next. Every attempt to outsmart the West, whether through genuine innovation or through those questionable methods stretching all the way back to that reverse-engineered 707, has run headfirst into the same wall. You cannot reverse-engineer decades of trust. You cannot copy decades of supplier relationships. And you cannot build a world-class jet engine overnight. But remember, it doesn't need to, not globally anyway. If China succeeds in redirecting even a substantial portion of its own massive domestic demand toward COMAC, it will surely reshape the economics of the entire industry. And if that homegrown engine ever works as promised, the leash the West is holding quietly disappears. The question is no longer whether COMAC is a serious contender. It already is. The real question is how long the West can hold the line before that billion-passenger giant finally learns to build the entire plane itself, engine and all.